Sometimes the world writes you off before you're ready to be written off. Sometimes a man's worth isn't measured by what others think he's lost, but by what he's willing to find. When 68-year-old Jeremiah Tate bought a crumbling shack for $1 the whole town of Dry Ridge figured the old cowboy had finally lost his mind. What they didn't know was that his weathered property sat on the edge of a hidden valley where over 200 wild Mustangs had roamed free for decades, protected by secrets no one could imagine. But when his horse leads him to this incredible discovery, will he have the strength to protect what no one believed was worth protecting? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The leather was cracked like dry riverbed clay, worn smooth in places where 60 years of riding had shaped it to fit just one man's frame. Jeremiah Tate ran his weathered fingers along the saddle horn, feeling every nick and scratch that told the story of a life spent in partnership with horses. The saddle sat on a makeshift stand in what passed for his barn, really just 3 walls and a tin roof that leaked when the wind blew right. But it was his, same as the broken-down shack and the 5 acres of scrubland that everyone in Dry Ridge thought he'd been a fool to buy. The morning sun filtered through gaps in the barn walls, casting long shadows across the dirt floor where Dusty stood patiently, his brown coat gleaming despite his 23 years. The horse was getting on, same as Jeremiah, but there was still strength in those legs and fire in those eyes. They understood each other in the way that only comes from decades of shared silence, shared work, shared loss. "Morning, old friend," Jeremiah murmured, his voice carrying the rasp of too many years, breathing dust and calling cattle. He lifted the saddle with arms that still held their strength, though his back protested more than it used to. The familiar weight settled onto Dusty's back like a prayer answered, and the horse's ears twitched forward in anticipation. Dry Ridge stretched out below them as they emerged from the barn, a town that time seemed determined to leave behind. Main Street was still dirt, though talk of paving it had been going on for 15 years. The buildings leaned against each other like old men sharing stories, their paint faded and their foundations settling into the hard-packed earth. The general store, the bank, Murphy's saloon and the post office, that was about all there was, unless you counted the grain elevator that hadn't seen much grain in recent years. Jeremiah had been born here 78 years ago, though he'd spent most of his life working ranches scattered across 3 counties. He'd come back 5 years ago when Martha took sick, thinking the clean air might help her breathe easier. She'd died anyway, peaceful in her sleep on a Tuesday morning while he was out feeding the chickens they didn't have anymore. The big ranch they'd worked for 40 years had been sold to developers shortly after that, and suddenly Jeremiah found himself with nowhere to go and not much money to get there. The shack had been sitting empty for over a decade when Jeremiah first laid eyes on it. Old Man Henderson had built it as a line shack back in the 1950s, but it had long since outlived its usefulness. The roof sagged, the windows were mostly gone, and the front porch looked like it might collapse if a cat jumped on it. But it had good bones, and it came with 5 acres that bordered the national forest, 5 acres that Henderson's estate was eager to unload for any price at all. Jeremiah had walked through that door with exactly $1 in his pocket, left over from Martha's funeral when someone had given him an old coin for luck. The estate lawyer had looked at him like he was touched in the head when he offered it, but the paperwork was already drawn up, and there was something poetic about the gesture that seemed to amuse the man. $1 for 5 acres and a shack. It had to be some kind of record. The townspeople had started talking before the ink was dry on the deed. Poor old Jeremiah finally lost what little sense he had left, buying a place that wasn't fit for storing hay, much less living in. But Jeremiah had spent 3 months that first summer patching the roof and boarding up the windows, making it livable enough for a man who didn't need much. He'd strung up a clothesline and built an outhouse, fixed the well pump and cleared a space for a small vegetable garden. It wasn't much, but it was his. The mornings were his favorite time, before the heat of the day and before the doubts that sometimes crept in during the long afternoons. He and Dusty would ride the fence line, checking for breaks that would let the neighbors' cattle wander in. Not that it mattered much. There wasn't anything worth eating on his 5 acres, except for some sagebrush and a few stubborn wildflowers that somehow found enough water to bloom each spring. Behind the shack, the land rose steadily toward the tree line, becoming rocky and difficult. Jeremiah had explored maybe half of it in the years since he'd moved in, finding nothing more interesting than a few deer trails and some weathered fence posts that spoke of boundaries drawn and forgotten long before he arrived. The Forest Service land began somewhere up there in the hills, though he'd never bothered to find exactly where. It didn't matter to him. All that mattered was having a place where he could wake up each morning and not have to answer to anyone about how he spent his day. Murphy's saloon was where the men gathered most evenings, and Jeremiah could hear his name mentioned from time to time when he rode past. Never mean-spirited exactly, but with the kind of gentle condescension reserved for old dogs and simple children. They'd known him all his life. These men had worked alongside him during the busy seasons, had drunk with him at weddings and wakes. But something had changed when he bought the shack. It was as if he'd crossed some invisible line from being merely old to being genuinely eccentric. That crazy old coot bought Henderson's line shack, they'd say, shaking their heads with a mixture of pity and amusement. Gave a whole $1 for it, too. Must have more money than sense. But Jeremiah knew better. He had exactly enough sense to understand that a man needs a place to belong, even if that place isn't much to look at. The shack might not be pretty, but it was quiet, and it was far enough from town that he could go days without seeing another soul, if that's what suited him. Dusty was company enough most days, and on the days when he wasn't, well, those were the days when Jeremiah would ride down to Murphy's for a beer and to listen to the younger men complain about cattle prices and government regulations. The land itself was a mystery in some ways. The soil was poor for farming, but adequate for grazing, though he only kept Dusty and had no plans for more animals. There were natural springs scattered through the hills behind the shack, which explained why. The grass stayed green longer than it should have in such rocky ground. Sometimes at night, when the wind was still, he could hear water running somewhere up in the darkness, streams that had to be coming from deeper in the Forest Service land. Martha would have loved the peace of it, he thought, as he guided Dusty along the property line. She'd always said that the best part of ranch life was the quiet moments between the chaos, when a person could actually hear themselves think. She'd been good with horses, better than most men, and she would have appreciated Dusty's steady nature and gentle temperament. The horse had outlived 2 other mounts and showed no signs of slowing down, though Jeremiah sometimes worried about what would happen when Dusty's time came. A man his age didn't have many horses left in him. The shack had been transformed over the years from barely habitable to genuinely comfortable. Jeremiah had insulated the walls and installed a wood-burning stove that kept the place warm even during the worst winter storms. He'd built simple furniture, a table, a chair, a bed frame, from lumber he'd salvaged from other abandoned buildings. In the area, the walls were hung with photographs from his working days, him and Martha at various ranches, prize bulls and beloved horses, landscapes that spoke of a life spent under wide skies. But it was the saddle that remained the most important thing he owned. It had been made by a craftsman in Billings back in 1965, custom-fitted to his measurements when he was still young and ambitious and thought he might someday own a spread of his own. Martha had saved for 2 years to buy it for his 30th birthday, working extra shifts at the diner in town and setting aside every spare dollar. The leather had been supple and golden then, the silver conchos bright and unmarked by weather. Now it bore the patina of decades, the leather dark with oil and sweat and rain, the silver tarnished but still functional. It had carried him through roundups and brandings, through blizzards and droughts, through the slow, satisfying days of working cattle and the heart-stopping moments when a horse would spook or a bull would charge. It fit him like a second skin, adjusted to his body and his riding style in ways that no new saddle ever could. The morning ride was a ritual that helped him organize his thoughts and plan his day. There wasn't much planning required. Feed Dusty, tend the small garden, maybe fix something that had broken during the night, but the rhythm of it was soothing. The horse moved with the easy gait of an animal that understood its job and took pride in doing it well, picking his way carefully over rocks and around holes without being asked. From the highest point on his property, Jeremiah could see most of dry ridge spread out below, looking smaller and more fragile than it seemed when he was walking down Main Street. The new highway bypassed the town by 15 miles, which meant that most travelers never knew it existed. That was probably for the best. Dry Ridge wasn't the kind of place that benefited from too much attention from the outside world. As they rode, Jeremiah found his thoughts turning to the future in a way they rarely did anymore. At 68, he'd learned to focus on the day at hand rather than worry about what might come next. But something about the morning light and the steady rhythm of Dusty's hooves made him wonder what would happen to this place when he was gone. The town would probably be relieved to see the last of crazy old Jeremiah and his worthless 5 acres. They'd sell it to the first person who made an offer, and within a year or two, there would be nothing left to show that he'd ever been here at all. The thought didn't particularly bother him. He'd long ago made peace with the temporary nature of human concerns, but it did make him appreciate what he had while he had it. The silence broken only by wind through the sagebrush, the vast sky that seemed to go on forever in every direction. The simple pleasure of a good horse and a comfortable saddle, and nowhere in particular that he needed to be. It happened on a Tuesday morning in early October, when the air held that crisp promise of winter, and the aspens up in the hills had turned the color of old gold. Jeremiah was adjusting Dusty's bridle, the same worn leather bridle he'd been using for 15 years, when the horse suddenly threw his head up, ears pricked forward, like he'd heard something that demanded immediate attention. "Easy there, old boy," Jeremiah murmured, trying to calm the animal with his voice, but Dusty was having none of it. The horse sidestepped nervously, then reared up so suddenly that the bridle strap snapped right at the bit, leaving Jeremiah holding useless leather while Dusty wheeled around and bolted toward the hills behind the shack. For a moment, Jeremiah just stood there in disbelief, watching 23 years of partnership disappear into the scrub oak and sagebrush. Dusty had never run off, not once in all their years together. The horse was steady as bedrock, reliable as sunrise. But there he went, tail streaming behind him like a flag of rebellion, headed straight up the steep slope toward the tree line. "Dusty," Jeremiah called, though he knew it was pointless. The horse was already out of earshot, moving with a purpose that suggested this wasn't random panic, but something else entirely. Something had called to him, and whatever it was, had been strong enough to overcome decades of training and trust. Jeremiah dropped the broken bridle and headed for the shack to get his boots and jacket. If Dusty had decided to go exploring, there was nothing to do but follow and hope the old horse had enough sense not to get himself hurt up in those rocks. The terrain beyond his property line was rough country, full of hidden ravines and loose shale that could break a leg if a horse wasn't careful. The climb was harder than Jeremiah remembered. He'd explored these hills before, but never with such urgency, and never while following a runaway horse. His breathing came heavy in the thin air, and more than once he had to stop and rest, wondering if he was fool enough to have a heart attack chasing after an animal that probably knew these mountains better than he did. The trail, if it could be called a trail, wound between granite outcroppings and stands of pine that had somehow found purchase in the rocky soil. Jeremiah could see Dusty's hoofprints in the soft earth between the stones, clear as road signs pointing the way forward. The horse was moving steadily uphill, following what appeared to be an old game trail that Jeremiah had never noticed before. After an hour of climbing, the tracks led around a massive boulder that blocked the view ahead. Jeremiah paused to catch his breath, leaning against the warm stone and wondering how much farther he'd have to go. The forest was thicker here, and he could hear water running somewhere nearby, one of those hidden streams that seem to appear and disappear without warning in this country. When he finally worked his way around the boulder, what he saw stopped him cold. The land opened up into a valley that couldn't be seen from below, a hidden bowl maybe half a mile across and completely enclosed by steep walls. But it wasn't the geography that took his breath away. It was what lived in the valley. Horses, wild horses. More horses than Jeremiah had seen in one place since his working days on the big ranches. They were scattered across the valley floor, like living sculptures, some grazing, others standing alert with their heads raised toward his position. He counted quickly, lost track, started over. 50, 70, maybe more. Mares with colts, young stallions, an old bay horse that looked like he might be the herd leader. And there, right in the middle of them all, was Dusty. The sight of his gentle saddle horse standing calmly among a herd of wild Mustangs should have been alarming, but somehow it wasn't. Dusty looked like he belonged there, like he'd finally found his way home after years of wandering. Several of the wild horses had approached him, touching noses in the way horses do when they're getting acquainted. There was no fear, no aggression, just recognition, as if they were old friends meeting again after a long separation. Jeremiah eased himself down onto a fallen log, trying to process what he was seeing. This valley didn't exist on any map he'd ever seen. It was completely hidden from the outside world, accessible only through the narrow gap he'd just come through. The walls rose straight up on three sides, creating a natural fortress that would be invisible to anyone passing by. On the fourth side, a small stream flowed out through a cut in the rock, so narrow that a man would have to walk sideways to follow it. The horses themselves were magnificent. They moved with the fluid grace of animals that had never known the weight of a saddle or the constraint of fences. Their coats gleamed with health, and even from a distance Jeremiah could see the intelligence in their eyes, the alertness that came from generations of surviving on their own. These weren't feral horses that had escaped from ranches. These were truly wild, bloodlines that probably stretched back to the Spanish horses that had first come to this country centuries ago. But how was such a thing possible? This was the 21st century, not the old days when wild herds roamed freely across the Western territories. Every piece of public land was mapped and managed, every herd counted and catalogued. Yet here was a valley full of wild horses, living as if the modern world had never touched them. Jeremiah sat in wonder for what felt like hours, watching the herd go about their daily business. Mares nursed their foals while keeping one eye on the surrounding cliffs. Young horses played and sparred, testing their strength against each other in the eternal dance of establishing dominance. The old bay stallion, clearly the leader, moved among them all with the confident ease of a patriarch who knew his authority was unquestioned. As the afternoon sun slanted lower into the valley, Jeremiah finally stirred himself to action. He needed to get Dusty and head back down the mountain before dark. The descent would be treacherous enough in daylight, and he had no desire to navigate those loose rocks by moonlight. He made his way carefully down into the valley, moving slowly and speaking softly to avoid spooking the wild horses. To his amazement, they didn't run. A few moved away from him, but most simply watched with curious eyes as this strange two-legged creature walked among them. It was as if they understood that he posed no threat, that he was as amazed by them as they seemed to be by him. Dusty nickered softly as Jeremiah approached, but made no move to come to him. The horse was clearly reluctant to leave this magical place, and Jeremiah couldn't blame him. If he were a horse, he'd want to stay here too, in this hidden paradise where the grass was sweet and the water was clean, and the only law was the ancient rhythm of the seasons. "Come on, old friend," Jeremiah said gently, reaching out to stroke Dusty's neck. "We need to get home before dark, but we'll come back, I promise." It took some coaxing, but eventually Dusty allowed himself to be led away from the herd. The wild horses watched them go, with what seemed like understanding, as if they knew that the gentle saddle horse would return when the time was right. The climb back up and out of the valley was easier than Jeremiah had expected, maybe because his mind was so full of what he'd seen that he forgot to pay attention to his protesting muscles. The broken bridle didn't matter anymore. Dusty followed him willingly, as if the sight of his wild cousins had reminded him of the bond between horse and human that went deeper than any piece of leather. By the time they reached the shack, the sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky the color of ripe peaches. Jeremiah turned Dusty out into the small corral and stood for a long moment, looking back toward the hills that hid such an incredible secret. 200 wild horses. Maybe more, living free in a valley that the rest of the world didn't even know existed, and it was all on his land. His 5 acres of worthless scrubland were apparently the gateway to something that defied every assumption the modern world made about wildlife management and land use. The estate lawyer who had sold him the property probably never knew what lay hidden in those hills. Old Man Henderson might not have known either. The valley was well beyond the area where cattle would normally graze. As Jeremiah walked slowly toward the shack, he realized that everything had just changed. The townspeople who laughed at his foolish purchase of a broken-down homestead had no idea that he was now the protector of something precious beyond measure. The question was, what was he going to do about it? Jeremiah spent 3 sleepless nights, staring at the ceiling of his shack, trying to decide whether what he'd seen in the hidden valley was a blessing or a curse. Every time he closed his eyes, he could see those magnificent horses moving like living poetry across the valley floor. And every time he opened them, he was faced with the weight of what that discovery meant. On the 4th morning, he pulled out an old piece of brown paper from a grocery bag and spread it across his kitchen table. With a pencil stub that had seen better days, he began to draw. The lines were rough at first. Jeremiah had never been much of an artist, but gradually a map began to take shape. The shack in the lower right corner, represented by a simple square. The climbing trail marked with a dotted line that wound. Between the rocks and trees, the massive boulder that blocked the view of the valley entrance, drawn as a large circle with Big Rock, written beside it in careful block letters. The valley itself was the hardest part to capture on paper. How do you draw something that seems to exist outside the normal rules of geography? Jeremiah sketched it as an irregular oval, then added the stream that flowed out through the narrow gap. He marked the approximate location where he'd first seen the horses, putting a small X and writing "First Sight" beside it. Along the edges of the valley, he noted the steep walls that made it invisible from the outside world. When he was finished, the map looked like something a child might draw, all crooked lines and uncertain proportions. But it was accurate in the ways that mattered, and more importantly, it was proof that the valley was real. Looking at it spread out on his table made the whole experience seem less like a dream and more like something he was going to have to figure out how to handle. The practical questions were staggering. How long had the horses been there? How had they survived without human intervention? What would happen if word got out about their existence? And most troubling of all, what was his responsibility as the apparent owner of the land that provided their only access to safety? Jeremiah had spent his whole life working with domestic horses, but he knew enough about wild herds to understand that what he'd discovered was extraordinary. Wild horses in this part of the country were supposed to be carefully managed by government agencies, their numbers controlled and their movements tracked. Yet here was a herd that seemed to exist completely outside that system, thriving in a place that didn't officially exist. The first interruption to his brooding came on Friday afternoon, when a black SUV with out-of-state plates pulled up in front of his shack. Jeremiah watched from his kitchen window as two men in expensive suits climbed out and stood looking around the property with the calculating eyes of people who saw dollar signs instead of landscapes. The older man was tall and silver-haired, with the kind of confident bearing that suggested he was used to getting his way. His companion was younger, maybe 40, with carefully styled hair and shoes that had never touched dirt before today. They stood talking for a few minutes, pointing toward different parts of the property, before finally approaching the front door. "Mr. Tate?" The older man's smile was as polished as his appearance. "My name is Marcus Whitmore, and this is my associate, David Chen. We represent Pinnacle Development Corporation. I wonder if we might have a few minutes of your time to discuss a business opportunity." Jeremiah stepped out onto his sagging porch, acutely aware of how shabby everything must look to these city men. "Don't recall asking for any business opportunities," he said mildly. Whitmore's smile never wavered. "Of course not, sir, but sometimes the best opportunities are the ones we never see coming. We've been studying this area for potential development, and your property, well, it's perfectly positioned for what we have in mind." "Development of what?" "Vacation homes, primarily. High-end cabins for people who want to experience the authentic Montana lifestyle without giving up modern conveniences. Your 5 acres would be ideal for the entrance road and visitor facilities. We're prepared to make you a very generous offer." Jeremiah glanced toward the hills where the valley lay hidden. "Not interested in selling. I understand your attachment to the place," Whitmore said, his tone becoming more persuasive. "A man builds a life somewhere. He doesn't want to just walk away from it. But think about this. You could take our offer and buy a much nicer place anywhere you wanted. Maybe somewhere closer to town with better access to medical facilities. At your age, that might be worth considering." The casual reference to his age stung more than Jeremiah wanted to admit, but he kept his expression neutral. "Like I said, not interested." David Chen spoke for the first time, his voice carrying a hint of impatience that his boss was better at hiding. "Mr. Tate, we're talking about serious money here, more than this property could ever be worth for ranching or farming. You'd be foolish not to at least listen to the specifics." "David," Whitmore said quietly, but there was warning in the single word. He turned back to Jeremiah with renewed courtesy. "What my colleague means is that we'd like to present you with some figures. No obligation, of course, just information that might help you make an informed decision." Jeremiah folded his arms across his chest. "Already made my decision. This is my home, and I'm staying." The two men exchanged a look that suggested this wasn't the response they'd been expecting. Whitmore pulled a business card from his jacket pocket and held it out. "Well, if you change your mind, please don't hesitate to call. Our offer will remain open for the foreseeable future." Jeremiah took the card, but didn't look at it. "Good day, gentlemen." After they drove away, he stood on his porch for a long time, thinking about what their visit might mean. Development companies didn't just randomly show up at remote properties with offers to buy. They did their research, studied maps, analyzed potential profits. The fact that they were interested in his 5 acres suggested that someone had identified this area as having value he didn't understand. That evening, he rode Dusty back up to the valley, taking the hand-drawn map with him to check its accuracy. The horses were still there, of course. Where else would they go? And they seemed to accept his presence more easily than they had the first time. He spent an hour studying the layout of the valley, making small corrections to his map and adding details he'd missed before. There was a natural spring near the far end of the valley that fed the stream. The grass was thick and nutritious, probably sustained by underground water sources that kept it green even during dry spells. No wonder the horses looked so healthy. They were living in a natural paradise that provided everything they needed. But as Jeremiah studied the terrain, he also began to see it through the eyes of developers like Whitmore. The valley would be perfect for an exclusive resort. The natural walls would provide privacy and dramatic views. The stream could be dammed to create a small lake. The entrance could be widened and paved to allow easy access for construction equipment. The thought made him feel sick. These horses had been living here undisturbed for who knew how long, raising their young and following the ancient patterns of their kind. If developers got hold of this land, that would all end. The horses would be relocated at best, destroyed. At worst, their hidden sanctuary would become just another playground for wealthy people who wanted to experience authentic wilderness from the comfort of luxury accommodations. Jeremiah folded the map carefully and tucked it into his jacket pocket. Whatever it took, he wasn't going to let that happen. The horses had trusted him with their secret, and he wasn't going to betray that trust for any amount of money. But as he rode back down the mountain in the gathering darkness, he couldn't shake the feeling that Marcus Whitmore wasn't the type of man who gave up easily. If one approach didn't work, he'd try another and another, until eventually he found a way to get what he wanted. The question was, how long could one old man hold out against a development corporation with unlimited resources and professional persistence? Jeremiah had never thought of himself as a fighter, but it looked like he was about to find out whether he had any fight left in him. The brass button was half buried in the soft earth near the valley's natural spring, its surface green with age, but still clearly marked with the distinctive eagle and shield design of the U.S. cavalry. Jeremiah picked it up with fingers that trembled slightly, not from the morning cold, but from the sudden understanding that he wasn't the first person to discover this hidden place. He'd been coming to the valley every day for a week, drawn by a mixture of wonder and worry that he couldn't quite explain. The horses had grown accustomed to his presence, though they still maintained a respectful distance. Some of the younger ones had even shown curiosity, approaching close enough that he could see the intelligence and wariness in their dark eyes before they would wheel away to rejoin the herd. But it was the button that changed everything. As he knelt by the spring, examining the artifact in the early morning light, Jeremiah realized that someone else had known about these horses. Someone had been here before him, maybe long before him, and that someone had worn the uniform of the United States Army. The implications were staggering. If military personnel had known about this valley, why wasn't it on any official maps? Why hadn't the horses been removed or relocated decades ago when the government was rounding up wild herds for management purposes? And most puzzling of all, how had this place remained secret for so long? Jeremiah slipped the button into his shirt pocket and spent the rest of the morning walking the perimeter of the valley, looking for other signs of human presence. What he found was subtle but unmistakable. Old campfire rings, carefully built with stones from the stream bed, the remnants of what might have been a lean-to shelter in a protected alcove, and worn spots in the grass that suggested someone had made regular trips to specific locations. Someone had lived here, or at least spent considerable time here, and had done so with great care to avoid disturbing the natural balance of the place. Whoever it was had understood that they were guardians of something precious, not conquerors of something to be exploited. When Jeremiah returned to his shack that afternoon, he found Marcus Whitmore waiting for him again, this time alone, and with a different approach. The expensive suit had been replaced by jeans and boots that looked new, but were clearly intended to suggest a man who understood rural life. The polished smile was still there, but it was accompanied by a more serious demeanor. "Mr. Tate," Whitmore said, rising from where he'd been sitting on the porch steps. "I hope you don't mind that I came back. I felt like we got off on the wrong foot the other day, and I wanted to try again." "Told you I wasn't interested in selling," Jeremiah replied, dismounting from Dusty and beginning to unsaddle the horse. "I know, and I respect that. But I also think you might not fully understand what you're sitting on here." Whitmore gestured toward the hills. "This isn't just about vacation homes anymore. We've done more extensive surveys of the area, and the potential is much greater than we initially thought." Jeremiah continued his work with Dusty, not trusting himself to speak. If Whitmore's people had done surveys, how much did they know? Had they discovered the valley? The thought made his stomach tighten with dread. The geological surveys show unusual water sources up in those hills, Whitmore continued. Natural springs that could support a much larger development than we originally envisioned. We're talking about a complete resort community. Hotels, restaurants, maybe even a small airstrip for private planes. The kind of destination that would put this whole area on the map. Don't want to be on any maps, Jeremiah said quietly. Whitmore laughed, a sound that was probably meant to seem friendly, but came across as condescending. Mr. Tate, progress is coming whether we want it or not. The new interstate extension is going to bring development to this whole region. The question isn't whether change is coming, it's whether the people who live here now are going to benefit from it or be left behind, been left behind before, still here, but for how long? The question carried a subtle threat that Whitmore tried to disguise as concern. Property taxes are going to increase as land values rise. Services are going to become more expensive. A man on a fixed income might find it difficult to keep up with the changing economics of the area. Jeremiah finished with Dusty and turned to face Whitmore directly. You threatening me? Not at all. I'm trying to help you see reality. Development is coming to this area, whether your property is part of it or not. The smart move is to get ahead of it, to profit from it rather than be displaced by it. Whitmore pulled out a folded document from his jacket. I've had our legal team draw up a preliminary offer. The numbers might surprise you. Jeremiah didn't take the paper. Already told you my answer. Just look at it, please. If nothing else, you'll know what your property is really worth in today's market. Against his better judgment, Jeremiah unfolded the document and glanced at the figure written in bold numbers at the bottom. It was more money than he'd seen in one place in his entire life. Enough to buy a nice house anywhere he wanted. Enough to live comfortably for the rest of his days without worrying about expenses. It was also exactly the wrong thing to offer him. You think this is about money? Jeremiah asked, handing the paper back. Isn't everything ultimately? Whitmore's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something calculating and cold underneath. You're 68 years old, living alone in a shack that's barely habitable. This money could buy you a comfortable retirement, maybe somewhere with better medical facilities. What's the alternative? Dying broke and forgotten on 5 acres of worthless scrubland? The words stung because they contained just enough truth to be painful. Jeremiah was getting older, and he was living alone, and his resources were limited. But what Whitmore didn't understand, what he couldn't understand, was that some things weren't for sale at any price. The alternative, Jeremiah said quietly, is living according to my own values instead of yours. After Whitmore left, clearly frustrated but not yet defeated, Jeremiah sat on his porch and examined the cavalry button more carefully. The eagle was still sharp despite decades of weathering, and when he cleaned away the worst of the corrosion, he could make out part of a regimental number, possibly the 7th, though the metal was too damaged to be certain. That evening he drove his old pickup truck into town for the first time in weeks, pulling up in front of the Dry Ridge Library just as Mrs. Eleanor Patterson was locking up for the night. Eleanor had been the town librarian for 40 years and possessed the kind of institutional memory that made her invaluable for anyone researching local history. Jeremiah Tate, she said with genuine pleasure. Haven't seen you in months. What brings you to town? Need to look up some old records if you've got them. Military history specifically. Cavalry units that might have operated in this area back in the old days. Eleanor's eyes lit up with the enthusiasm of a librarian, presented with an interesting research challenge. Well, that's quite specific. Mind if I ask what prompted the interest? Jeremiah pulled the brass button from his pocket and showed it to her. Found this up on my property. Got me curious about who might have lost it. Eleanor examined the button with the practiced eye of someone who'd handled countless historical artifacts. This is definitely cavalry, probably 1880s or 1890s based on the design. Let me unlock the door. I've got some military records in the back room that might be helpful. For the next 2 hours, they pored over old documents and maps, tracing the movements of various cavalry units through the region during the late 19th century. Most of the records were routine: patrol routes, supply requisitions, reports of minor skirmishes with cattle rustlers or horse thieves. But buried in a folder of miscellaneous correspondence, Eleanor found something that made both of them pause. It was a brief report dated 1887, written by a Captain William Tate of the 7th Cavalry, requesting permission to establish a temporary observation post in the hills north of what would eventually become Dry Ridge. The request was approved, but there were no follow-up reports about what the observation post had observed or how long it had remained active. Tate, Eleanor said thoughtfully. Any relation? Jeremiah stared at the faded signature at the bottom of the report. The handwriting was formal and precise, the signature of a man accustomed to military discipline. But there was something about the way the letters were formed that seemed familiar, something that reminded him of his own father's careful penmanship. "Don't know," he said, "but I aim to find out." The photograph was tucked inside a leather portfolio that Jeremiah found wedged behind a loose stone in the valley's far wall, as if someone had deliberately hidden it for safekeeping. The image was sepia-toned and cracked with age, but clear enough to take his breath away. It showed a man in cavalry uniform standing among a herd of horses that were unmistakably the ancestors of the Mustangs that still roamed the valley. The officer's face was weathered and kind, with the same deep-set eyes that Jeremiah saw in his own mirror every morning. But it was the way he stood among the horses that struck Jeremiah most powerfully, not as a conqueror or captor, but as a protector. The horses showed no fear of the uniformed man. Several were grazing peacefully just a few feet away, while others looked directly at the camera with calm, trusting eyes. Written on the back in faded ink were the words, "For whoever comes after, guard them well. W. Tate, 1889. Jeremiah sat heavily on a nearby rock, the photograph trembling in his hands. Captain William Tate wasn't just any cavalry officer who had happened upon this valley. He was family, and he had been protecting these horses for reasons that were becoming clearer with each piece of evidence Jeremiah uncovered. The sound of horses approaching made him look up. A small group of mares had wandered closer, led by a grey mare with intelligent eyes and a confident bearing that marked her as one of the herd's leaders. She stopped just outside of arm's reach and studied him with the same careful attention he was paying to her, as if she were trying to understand what his presence meant for her family. "Your guardian's been gone a long time," Jeremiah said softly to the mare. "But his great-nephew's here now, if that counts for anything." The mare tilted her head as if considering this information, then took a single step closer, close enough that Jeremiah could have reached out and touched her neck if he'd dared. Instead, he remained perfectly still, understanding that this was a moment of decision for both of them. The mare was choosing whether to trust him, and he was accepting the responsibility that trust would bring. After what felt like an eternity, the mare reached out with her muzzle and gently touched his shoulder, her breath warm against his neck. It was a gesture of acceptance that brought tears to Jeremiah's eyes, recognition that he was now part of the ancient compact between his family and this herd. The spell was broken by the sound of voices echoing off the valley walls, human voices, male and aggressive, coming from the direction of the narrow entrance. Jeremiah quickly tucked the photograph into his jacket and moved to a position where he could see the gap without being seen himself. 3 men in expensive outdoor gear were forcing their way through the entrance, led by David Chen, Whitmore's aggressive young associate. They carried surveying equipment and cameras, and their conversation carried the confident arrogance of people who believed they had every right to be wherever they chose to go. "This is it," Chen was saying to his companions. "The geological Surveys were right. There's a complete watershed up here. Natural springs, year-round water flow, perfect drainage. We could build whatever we want in this valley and never worry about water rights. Jeremiah felt his stomach drop as he watched the men spread out across the valley floor, taking photographs and making notes. The horses had retreated to the far end of the valley, but they were clearly visible to anyone who cared to look. One of the men was already pointing them out to the others, discussing them as if they were just another obstacle to be dealt with. "Are those wild horses?" one of the surveyors asked. "Feral, probably," Chen replied dismissively. "Escaped ranch stock that's been breeding up here for a few years. The Bureau of Land Management will round them up once we file the proper paperwork. Might even be a tax write-off for the company, helping clean up environmental problems." The casual callousness of the comment made Jeremiah's hands clench into fists. These weren't environmental problems. They were living creatures with a history in this valley that stretched back over a century. But to Chen and his companions, they were just inconveniences to be eliminated. Jeremiah stayed hidden until the men left, then made his way quickly back to his shack. He needed help, and he needed it fast. The developers had found the valley, which meant time was running out. But who could he turn to? Most of the people in Dry Ridge thought he was a harmless eccentric at best, and many would probably see dollar signs if they learned about the potential development value of his property. The answer came to him as he was feeding Dusty that evening. Dr. Sarah Chen, no relation to David Chen, despite the shared surname, was the young veterinarian who had set up practice in Dry Ridge 6 months ago. She'd treated Dusty for a minor cut a few weeks back, and Jeremiah had been impressed by her gentle competence and obvious love for animals. More importantly, she'd mentioned during that visit that she'd written her veterinary thesis on wild horse populations and their conservation. The next morning, Jeremiah drove into town and found Dr. Chen at her clinic, a converted garage behind the old grain elevator. She was examining a border collie with what appeared to be a minor injury, speaking to the dog in the same soft, reassuring tones she'd used with Dusty. "Mr. Tate," she said with surprise when he appeared in the doorway. "How's Dusty doing?" "That. You got healing up properly?" "Dusty's fine, Doc. It's something else I need to talk to you about, something that might sound crazy at first." Sarah finished bandaging the collie and turned her full attention to Jeremiah. She was younger than his own daughter would have been, maybe 35, with the kind of focused intelligence that suggested she'd worked hard to get where she was. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her hands moved with the confident precision of someone who spent her days healing animals. "I'm listening," she said simply. Jeremiah pulled out the faded photograph and handed it to her. "Found this up on my property, along with about 200 wild horses that shouldn't exist." Sarah's eyes widened as she studied the photograph, her professional composure giving way to obvious excitement. "Where exactly did you find this? And did you say 200 horses?" "Hidden Valley, about an hour's ride from my place. Been going up there every day for 2 weeks, trying to figure out what to do about it. Problem is, I'm not the only one who knows about it anymore." Jeremiah told her about the developers, about Whitmore's increasingly aggressive attempts to buy his property, and about David Chen's survey team discovering the valley. Sarah listened with growing alarm, asking occasional questions that demonstrated her understanding of both the biological and legal implications of what he was describing. "This is incredible," she said when he finished. "If these horses have been isolated for over a century, they could represent one of the purest bloodlines left in North America. The genetic value alone would be immeasurable for conservation efforts." "Values, not what I'm worried about," Jeremiah said. "It's keeping them safe. These developers see them as problems to be solved, not animals to be protected." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, studying the photograph with the intensity of someone working through complex calculations. "There might be legal protections available," she said finally. "Federal laws governing wild horse populations, environmental impact requirements for development projects. But we'd need documentation, genetic testing, proof that this is a genuine wild herd and not just escaped. Domestic stock. How long would that take? Months, maybe longer. And that's assuming we could get the bureaucracy to move quickly, which is never a safe assumption. Sarah looked up from the photograph with determination in her eyes. But there might be another way. If I could examine the horses myself, document their condition and behavior, establish their wild status, that might be enough to trigger immediate protections while the longer legal processes play out. Jeremiah felt a spark of hope for the first time since David Chen had invaded the valley. You'd be willing to do that? Mr. Tate, what you've shown me is probably the most important conservation discovery in this state in decades. Of course I'm willing to help. Sarah handed the photograph back to him with careful reverence. When can we go? Tomorrow morning, if you're ready. But Doc, once you see them, once you understand what we're dealing with, there's no going back. These developers aren't going to give up easy, and anyone who gets in their way is going to become a target. Sarah's smile was fierce and determined. Then I guess we'd better make sure we're ready for a fight. The document was hidden in the same stone crevice where Jeremiah had found the photograph, wrapped in oiled leather that had protected it from over a century of weather. Sarah's hands shook slightly as she carefully unfolded the yellowed papers, revealing the official seal of the United States Land Office and the flowing script of 19th century legal language. "This is it," she whispered, her voice filled with awe. "This is the original homestead patent, signed by Captain William Tate in 1888. But look at this clause here." She pointed to a section of dense legal text near the bottom of the document. He specifically reserved protection rights for indigenous wildlife populations currently residing on said property, with particular attention to the preservation of natural breeding grounds and seasonal migration patterns. Jeremiah squinted at the faded ink, trying to make sense of the formal language. "What's that mean in regular words?" "It means your great-great-uncle was a lot smarter than anyone gave him credit for," Sarah said, excitement building in her voice. "He embedded conservation language directly into the land patent. Under federal law, these kinds of historical preservation clauses are still legally binding, even after multiple property transfers. They were sitting on a flat rock near the valley's spring, surrounded by the peaceful sounds of horses grazing and water flowing over stone. The morning mist was just beginning to lift from the valley floor, revealing the full scope of the herd that had trusted this hidden place with their survival for over a century. Sarah had spent 3 hours examining the horses with the careful eye of a professional, documenting their condition, behavior, and genetic markers. Her initial excitement had given way to profound respect as she observed the complex social dynamics of a truly wild herd, behaviors that domestic horses rarely displayed even when turned out to pasture. "They're magnificent," she'd said more than once, watching a group of yearlings play while their mothers kept watchful eyes on the surrounding cliffs. "This isn't just a breeding population, it's a complete ecosystem. They've developed their own traditions, their own knowledge about how to survive in this specific environment." Now, with the land grant document spread before them, they had something even more valuable than biological evidence. They had legal standing. "So this document means the horses are protected?" Jeremiah asked. "It means they should be protected," Sarah corrected. "Whether that protection will hold up against a determined development corporation is another question entirely. Legal battles take time and money, 2 things we're short on." "How much time do you think we have?" Sarah folded the document carefully and handed it back to him. "Based on what you've told me about this Whitmore character, not long. If his people have already surveyed the valley, they're probably preparing to file development permits. Once those are submitted, it becomes much harder to stop the process." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of vehicles approaching from below, multiple engines moving fast and with obvious purpose. Jeremiah and Sarah exchanged worried glances before moving to a position where they could observe the valley entrance without being seen. What they saw made Jeremiah's blood run cold. A convoy of 3 trucks was forcing its way up the narrow trail, led by a Bureau of Land Management vehicle, followed by 2 private security trucks bearing the Pinnacle Development logo. Men in official uniforms were accompanied by others in tactical gear that suggested they were prepared for trouble. "They're moving faster than I expected," Sarah said grimly. "Someone must have expedited the paperwork." The lead vehicle stopped at the valley entrance, and a man in a BLM uniform climbed out with a clipboard and an air of bureaucratic authority. He was followed by David Chen and 2 security guards who looked like they'd be more at home in an urban environment than the Montana wilderness. "Mr. Tate," Chen called out, his voice echoing off the valley walls. "We know you're up there. This is now officially a federal wildlife management operation. You need to come down here immediately." Jeremiah felt the weight of the land grant document in his jacket pocket and made a decision that surprised him with its clarity. Instead of hiding, he stood up and walked calmly toward the valley entrance, with Sarah close behind him. "Morning, gentlemen," he said with a politeness that masked his anger. "Quite a parade you've got there." The BLM official stepped forward, consulting his clipboard with the mechanical efficiency of a man following scripted procedures. "Mr. Tate, I'm Agent Morrison with the Bureau of Land Management. We've received reports of an unmanaged wild horse population on your property. Federal law requires us to conduct an immediate assessment and implement appropriate management protocols." "Management protocols," Jeremiah repeated. "That what they're calling horse theft these days?" "Sir, this is a legitimate federal operation conducted under the authority of the Wild Free-Roaming Horses and Burros Act. Any interference with our activities will result in criminal charges." Sarah stepped forward, her veterinary credentials giving her a professional authority that Morrison seemed to recognize. "Agent Morrison, I'm Dr. Sarah Chen, licensed veterinarian. I've been conducting my own assessment of this population. Have you reviewed the historical documentation regarding this land's protected status?" Morrison's confident demeanor faltered slightly. "What historical documentation?" Jeremiah pulled out the land grant document and handed it to the agent. "The kind that shows these horses have been under federal protection since 1888. As Morrison studied the document, his expression grew increasingly troubled. The legal language was clear enough that even a bureaucrat could understand its implications, and the official seals were genuine. After several minutes of consultation with papers from his own clipboard, he walked away from the group to make a phone call on his radio. David Chen watched this development with obvious frustration. "Agent Morrison, surely you're not going to let some old piece of paper interfere with a legitimate wildlife management operation?" "Mr. Chen," Morrison said carefully, "if this document is authentic, and it appears to be, then this situation is considerably more complicated than your company represented. I'm going to need to contact my supervisors for clarification on how to proceed." "How long will that take?" Chen demanded. "As long as it takes," Morrison replied, his tone suggesting that Chen's attitude was beginning to wear on his patience. "In the meantime, no one touches those horses." After the convoy departed, with significantly less confidence than they'd shown arriving, Jeremiah and Sarah sat in the peaceful valley, watching the horses resume their normal activities. The confrontation had left them both shaken, but also hopeful the legal protection might actually hold. "That was well played," Sarah said, "but Chen's not going to give up. If anything, this is going to make him more determined. What's our next move?" "We need copies of that document in safe places, and we need legal representation. I know an environmental lawyer in Billings who specializes in conservation cases. If we can get her involved, we might be able to file for permanent protected status before Pinnacle figures out a way around the historical protection clause." Jeremiah nodded, but his attention was focused on the horses. The grey mare that had first approached him was standing at the edge of the herd, watching him with what seemed like understanding. She had lived her entire life in this valley, as had her mother and grandmother before her. They had trusted humans once, trusted Captain William Tate to protect them from a world that saw them as obstacles to progress. Now that trust had passed to him, and he was determined not to fail them. "There's something else?" he said to Sarah. "Something I haven't told you yet." He told her about Marcus Whitmore's increasingly aggressive tactics, about the veiled threats regarding property taxes and medical expenses, about the feeling that he was being watched whenever he went to town. Sarah listened with growing concern, understanding that they weren't just fighting for the horses anymore. They were fighting for Jeremiah's right to remain on land that his family had protected for over a century. "They're trying to squeeze you out," she said. "Make life difficult enough that you'll take their money and leave. It's a common tactic with development companies." "Well, they picked the wrong old man to squeeze," Jeremiah said with more conviction than he'd felt in years. "These horses have been waiting over a century for someone to stand up for them. I'm not about to let them down now." The family Bible had been Martha's most treasured possession, a massive leather-bound volume that had belonged to her grandmother. Before her, Jeremiah had barely opened it since her funeral, finding the memories too painful to bear. But something about discovering the land grant document had stirred a need to understand his family's connection to this place. And on a quiet Sunday morning, he finally brought himself to carry the heavy book to his kitchen table, the genealogy. Pages were written in Martha's careful handwriting, documenting births and deaths, marriages and migrations that traced both their families back through generations of frontier life. Jeremiah had seen these pages before, of course, but he'd never paid much attention to the names and dates that seemed to have little relevance to his daily life. Now, with everything he'd learned about Captain William Tate, he studied the family. Tree with new eyes, his own lineage was traced back through his father, James Tate, and his grandfather, Samuel Tate. But it was the entry for Samuel's brother that stopped him cold. William Tate, 1849–1923. U.S. Army, 7th Cavalry. Married Sarah Clearwater, 1890. Children Thomas, 1891. Mary, 1893. Catherine, 1895. Homesteaded in Montana Territory, 1888. Known for his work protecting local wildlife. Jeremiah stared at the entry, his mind reeling with implications. Captain William Tate wasn't just some distant relative. He was Jeremiah's great-uncle, Samuel's younger brother. The man who had protected the horses in the hidden valley was family, blood of his blood, connected to him by bonds that went deeper than coincidence. But there was more. Martha had written a note in the margin beside William's entry. J's inheritance includes W's property, papers in safety deposit box. With hands that shook from more than age, Jeremiah drove to the bank named Dry Ridge and retrieved the contents of the safety deposit box he'd barely thought about since Martha's death. Inside were documents he'd assumed were routine: insurance papers, old property deeds, family photographs. But underneath those familiar items was a sealed envelope marked "For Jeremiah Tate, when the time comes." Inside the envelope was a letter, written in Martha's distinctive handwriting, dated just 2 months before her death. "My dearest Jeremiah," the letter began, "if you are reading this, then the valley has called to you as I always knew it would. I have carried this secret for 40 years, waiting for the right moment to share it with you. Your great-uncle William Tate was not just a cavalry officer. He was a guardian, chosen by the horses themselves to protect their sanctuary." Jeremiah's hands trembled as he read on, learning truths that transformed everything he thought he knew about his life. "William wrote to your grandfather before he died, telling him about the horses and the sacred trust that had been placed on our family. The homestead patent was deliberately written to pass that responsibility to future generations, but only when the horses were truly threatened. William believed that the valley would remain hidden as long as the outside world wasn't ready to respect what lived there. The letter went on to explain that Martha had known about the valley from the day they were married, but had respected William's instructions to keep the secret until development pressure threatened the horse's survival. She had guided Jeremiah to buy the seemingly worthless property, knowing that his gentle nature and love for animals made him the right guardian for the current age. "You were never meant to live out your days as a forgotten old man," Martha had written. "You were meant to fulfill the destiny that has been waiting in your bloodline for over a century. The horses have been patient, but their time of hiding is ending. They will need you to stand between them and a world that sees them only as obstacles to profit." Jeremiah set the letter down and walked outside, his mind struggling to process the magnitude of what he'd learned. Everything that had seemed like coincidence, finding the property, discovering the valley, even Dusty's sudden bolt toward the hills, had been part of a pattern that stretched back through generations. He wasn't just a random old man who had stumbled onto something extraordinary. He was the latest in a line of guardians, bred and trained for this exact purpose. The thought should have been overwhelming, but instead it brought a sense of peace that he hadn't felt since Martha's death. For the first time in years, he understood his place in the world and his reason for being where he was. His contemplation was interrupted by the sound of vehicles approaching. Not the aggressive convoy from earlier, but a single black SUV moving with careful purpose. Marcus Whitmore climbed out alone, his usual polished confidence replaced by something harder and more determined. "Mr. Tate," Whitmore said, his voice carrying a new edge of urgency, "I think it's time we had a more serious conversation already." "Told you I'm not selling," Jeremiah replied, but his voice carried a new authority that seemed to give Whitmore pause. "The situation has changed," Whitmore said. "My geological surveys have identified significant mineral deposits in those hills. We're not just talking about vacation homes anymore. We're talking about a major extraction operation that could bring hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue to this region." Extraction of what? Rare earth elements, the kind of materials that are essential for modern technology, but are difficult to find in economically viable concentrations. "Your property sits on what might be one of the richest deposits in North America." Jeremiah felt his stomach tighten. Mineral extraction would mean strip mining, the complete destruction of the valley and everything in it. The horses wouldn't just be relocated. Their entire world would be obliterated. "Still not interested," he said firmly. Whitmore's mask of civility finally slipped completely. "Mr. Tate, you need to understand that this is bigger than your personal preferences. We're talking about national strategic interests, materials that are critical to maintaining America's technological competitiveness. If you won't sell voluntarily, there are legal mechanisms that will force the sale. Eminent domain, mineral rights legislation, environmental emergency declarations. We have options." "And I have family obligations," Jeremiah said quietly. "Obligations that go back over a century and can't be bought off with any amount of money." "Family obligations?" Whitmore laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "You're a childless widower living alone in a shack. What family obligations could you possibly have?" Jeremiah pulled out the land grant document and Martha's letter, holding them where Whitmore could see the official seals and faded handwriting. The kind that bind a man to something bigger than himself. The kind that lasts longer than any development corporation or mining operation. For the first time since Jeremiah had met him, Whitmore looked genuinely uncertain. The developer was clearly a man who believed that every problem could be solved with enough money or pressure, but he was facing something outside his experience, a commitment that transcended personal interests. "Mr. Tate," Whitmore said, his tone shifting to something that might have been respect, "I can see that you're serious about this, but you need to understand the forces you're up against. This isn't just about Pinnacle development anymore. We're representing interests that have access to resources you can't imagine. Legal teams, political connections, federal agencies that can make your life very difficult if you continue to obstruct a project of this magnitude. Then I guess they'll have to make my life difficult, Jeremiah said, because those horses aren't going anywhere, and neither am I. After Whitmore left, clearly frustrated but not yet defeated, Jeremiah returned to the valley. The horses seemed to sense the change in him, approaching closer than they ever had before. The grey mare that had first touched his shoulder walked directly up to him, allowing him to stroke her neck, while her foal watched with curious eyes. "I understand now," he said to her quietly. "I understand why my family was chosen for this. And I understand what's expected of me. I won't let you down." As if in response, the mare pressed her forehead against his chest, a gesture of trust and acceptance that sealed a compact between them. Jeremiah was no longer just the accidental owner of 5 acres of scrubland. He was the guardian of a legacy that stretched back through generations, protector of a trust that was worth more than all the rare earth elements in the world. The battle for the valley was just beginning, but for the first time since this all started, Jeremiah knew exactly who he was and what he was fighting for. The service revolver was wrapped in oiled cloth at the bottom of a wooden chest that Jeremiah found in the deepest part of the hidden cave system behind the valley's spring. The weapon was a Colt single-action army, standard issue for cavalry officers in the 1880s, its metal still gleaming despite more than a century in storage. Engraved on the barrel in precise military script were the words, "Captain W. Tate, 7th Cavalry. Courage is not the absence of fear, but action in spite of it." Jeremiah held the revolver with reverent hands, feeling the weight of history and responsibility it represented. This wasn't just a weapon. It was a symbol of the courage that had protected these horses for over a century, and it was being passed to him at the moment when that courage would be tested most severely. Sarah had arrived at dawn with news that changed everything. The environmental lawyer from Billings, Rachel Morrison, had agreed to take their case pro bono, but she'd also brought disturbing intelligence about what they were really up against. "Pinnacle Development isn't just some regional company," Sarah explained as they sat in Jeremiah's kitchen, planning their strategy over strong coffee and the growing certainty that time was running out. "They're a subsidiary of a multinational mining consortium with connections that reach all the way to Washington. The rare earth deposits that Whitmore mentioned are apparently worth hundreds of billions of dollars, and there are people in the federal government who consider them a matter of national security." "What's that mean for us?" Jeremiah asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "It means we're not just fighting for the horses anymore. We're standing in the way of interests that won't hesitate to use every tool at their disposal to get what they want. Eminent domain, environmental, waivers, even congressional legislation if necessary." Rachel Morrison, a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s, with graying hair and the intense focus of someone who had spent her career taking on powerful adversaries, spread documents across the table that painted a sobering picture of their legal position. "The historical protection clause is strong," she said, "but it's not bulletproof. If they can establish that the mineral extraction serves a compelling federal interest, they might be able to override the original land grant. Our best defense is to get the valley designated as a protected wildlife sanctuary before they can file their mining permits." "How long do we have?" Jeremiah asked. "Days, maybe a week if we're lucky. I've filed preliminary injunctions to slow down the permitting process, but those are temporary measures at best. We need something that will force the federal government to choose between their strategic minerals and their commitment to wildlife conservation." The answer came from an unexpected source. Eleanor Patterson, the town librarian, had spent the weekend researching Captain William Tate's military service and had discovered something that changed the entire legal landscape. "He wasn't just protecting the horses for sentimental reasons," Eleanor explained when she arrived at the shack later that morning, carrying a folder full of copied documents. "He was following direct orders from the Department of the Interior. In 1887, there was a federal initiative to preserve genetic diversity in wild horse populations, and Captain Tate was assigned to establish a protected breeding preserve in this region. Rachel examined the documents with growing excitement. "This is it," she said. "This proves that the federal government explicitly designated this valley as a conservation area over 130 years ago. Any attempt to override that designation would require them to admit that they're abandoning their own conservation policies for commercial gain." But even as their legal position strengthened, the pressure from Pinnacle development intensified. Jeremiah began noticing strange vehicles parked on the roads around his property, men with cameras who seemed to be documenting his every move. His mail was being delayed, and phone calls to his few remaining friends in town were met with nervous evasions that suggested someone had been asking questions about him. Most troubling of all, Dusty had begun showing signs of stress, pacing restlessly in his corral and shying away from sounds that had never bothered him before. When Sarah examined the horse, she found evidence of mild sedation. Someone had been drugging his feed with compounds designed to make him lethargic and unresponsive. "They're trying to isolate you," Sarah said grimly. "Make you feel like you're fighting this battle alone, like everyone you care about is either gone or turning against you." But Jeremiah wasn't alone, and the proof came from the most unexpected directions. Murphy's saloon, which had been the center of gentle mockery about his foolish land purchase, had become a gathering place for people who were beginning to understand what was really at stake. Tom Murphy himself, a gruff man in his 60s who had never shown much interest in anything beyond his next beer sale, approached Jeremiah outside the post office with an offer that took him completely by surprise. "I heard you might be having some trouble with those development folks," Murphy said without preamble. "Also heard there might be wild horses involved." Jeremiah nodded cautiously, unsure where the conversation was heading. "Well, my grandfather used to tell stories about seeing wild horses in those hills when he was a boy," Murphy continued. "Always figured they were just tales, but if there's truth to them, well, some things are worth more than money." By the end of the week, an unlikely coalition had formed around Jeremiah's kitchen table. Murphy brought two of his regular customers, both retired ranchers who remembered when the land had been wilder and more free. Eleanor Patterson contributed her research skills and connections to historical preservation groups. Even Dr. Williams, the town's aging physician, offered his support after learning about the potential environmental impact of strip mining operations. But it was the arrival of an unexpected ally that truly changed the dynamic of their struggle. James Clearwater, a member of the Blackfeet Nation and a descendant of Sarah Clearwater, who had married Captain William Tate, arrived with documentation that added another layer of legal protection to their case. "The horses aren't just wildlife," James explained, his quiet dignity commanding the attention of everyone in the room. "They're part of our cultural heritage, descendants of the horses that our people lived with for centuries before the cavalry came. My great-great-grandmother Sarah worked with Captain Tate to protect them because she understood that some things belong to the future, not just the present." James brought with him tribal lawyers who specialized in federal Indian law, and their involvement transformed the legal landscape once again. Native American cultural preservation laws added another set of protections that would make it even more difficult for Pinnacle development to obtain the permits they needed. As the coalition grew stronger, so did the pressure from their opponents. Whitmore's visits became more frequent and more aggressive, often accompanied by men who claimed to be federal officials, but who carried themselves like private security contractors. Property taxes on Jeremiah's 5 acres suddenly doubled, then tripled, based on reassessments that conveniently aligned with Pinnacle's development timeline. More disturbing were the nighttime visitors, shadowy figures who left no trace except for the growing nervousness of the horses in the valley. Someone was conducting surveillance operations, probably using equipment that could monitor their conversations and track their movements. The feeling of being watched had become constant, oppressive, and deliberately intimidating. It was during One of these tense nights that Jeremiah finally understood why his great-uncle had left the service revolver in the cave. Courage wasn't about being unafraid. It was about doing what needed to be done, despite the fear. The weapon represented the willingness to stand ground when standing ground was the only option left. The final confrontation was approaching, and everyone knew it. Rachel Morrison had filed for emergency protected status for the valley, citing the historical preservation clauses, the federal conservation mandate, and the cultural significance to the Blackfeet Nation. Pinnacle Development had responded by filing counter-motions, claiming that national security interests trumped all other considerations. A federal judge in Helena would hear arguments from both sides in 3 days, and the decision would determine not just the fate of the horses, but the precedent for how conservation laws would be interpreted in the face of commercial pressure. "Whatever happens in court," Sarah said, as their coalition gathered for what might be their final planning session, "we need to be prepared for them to ignore the legal ruling if it goes against them. Companies with this much money and political influence don't always respect judicial decisions that threaten their profits." Jeremiah nodded, his hand unconsciously moving to his jacket pocket where he now carried Captain Tate's revolver. Not because he intended to use it. Violence would only give their opponents the excuse they needed to bring in federal law enforcement, but because it reminded him that some battles were worth fighting regardless of the odds. The horses were counting on him just as they had counted on his great-uncle over a century ago. His ancestors had faced their own powerful enemies and had found the courage to protect what mattered most. Now it was his turn to prove that the bloodline still carried that same strength. The valley was quiet that night, but it was the quiet of preparation, not peace. Something was coming, and everyone, human and horse alike, could feel it in the air. They came at dawn on Tuesday morning, a convoy of livestock trailers and heavy equipment that stretched for nearly a quarter-mile along the dirt road leading to Jeremiah's property. The vehicles bore the official markings of the Bureau of Land Management, but the men who climbed out of them moved with the practiced efficiency of private contractors who specialized in operations that regular government employees preferred not to handle directly. Jeremiah had been expecting them. Sarah's contacts in Helena had called the night before with news that a federal judge had issued a temporary injunction allowing emergency relocation of the horses pending the outcome of the legal hearings. It was a transparent manipulation of the legal system, but it carried enough official weight to provide cover for what was essentially a government-sanctioned raid. From his position on the ridge overlooking the valley entrance, Jeremiah watched the men set up portable corrals and loading chutes with military precision. Marcus Whitmore supervised the operation from the comfort of his air-conditioned SUV, occasionally speaking into a satellite phone that connected him to whoever was coordinating this effort from Washington. The horses had sensed the approaching danger hours before the trucks arrived. They milled nervously at the far end of the valley, bunched together in the defensive formation that wild herds had used for millennia when threatened by predators. The lead mare, the grey mare who had first shown him trust, stood apart from the group, her attention focused on the narrow gap that was their only escape route. But there would be no escape this time. The men had brought enough equipment to seal off the valley completely, trapping the horses inside a natural corral that would make the roundup quick and efficient. Within a few hours, over 200 wild horses would be loaded into trailers and transported to holding facilities where they would either be adopted to private owners or destroyed as surplus animals, unless someone stopped them. Jeremiah checked the loads in Captain Tate's revolver, not because he intended to use it against the men below, but because he needed the comfort of carrying something that connected him to his family's legacy of courage. Then he walked Dusty down into the valley, his mind calm, with the certainty that this was what he was meant to do. The lead mare watched him approach, her intelligent eyes reading something in his demeanor that seemed to reassure her. When he Stopped 20 feet away from the nervous herd, she walked slowly toward him, her head held high with the dignity that only truly wild creatures possess. "I know you're frightened," Jeremiah said softly, his voice carrying the authority he'd learned from a lifetime of working with horses. "But I'm not going to let them take you from your home, not while there's breath in my body." The mare stepped closer until her muzzle was almost touching his chest. Then, in a gesture that brought tears to his eyes, she lowered her head and pressed her forehead against his heart. It was an act of complete trust, a recognition that this human understood the sacred compact between their species and would honor it regardless of the cost. The moment was broken by the sound of men shouting and equipment rumbling as the roundup crew moved into position at the valley entrance. Jeremiah mounted Dusty and rode toward the gap, positioning himself directly in the path of the approaching vehicles. "Mr. Tate," Agent Morrison called out, his voice amplified by a bullhorn, "you need to move away from this area immediately. This is now a federal operation conducted under the authority of multiple agencies. Interference will result in arrest and federal charges." Jeremiah sat calmly in his saddle, making no move to comply. Behind him, the horses had begun to settle, somehow understanding that they had a protector who would not abandon them. "Those horses are under the protection of historical preservation laws," Jeremiah called back. "Any attempt to remove them violates federal conservation mandates that go back over 130 years. David Chen emerged from one of the trucks, his face flushed with impatience. "Morrison, we don't have time for this. The judge's order is clear. Remove the horses by any means necessary. If the old man won't move, arrest him." But Agent Morrison hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the situation he'd been ordered to handle. The presence of news crews that had arrived that morning, summoned by Sarah and her growing coalition of supporters, meant that everything happening here would be recorded and broadcast. Arresting a 68-year-old man for protecting wild horses was not the kind of publicity that federal agencies preferred. "Mr. Tate," Morrison said, his tone becoming more conciliatory, "we understand your concerns, but we have our orders. These horses need to be relocated for their own safety. The mining operation that's been approved for this area will make it impossible for them to survive here." "No mining operation has been approved," Sarah's voice rang out from the ridge above them. She was approaching on horseback, accompanied by James Clearwater and a delegation from the Blackfeet Nation. Behind them came an unlikely cavalry of townspeople, ranchers, and environmental activists who had decided that some lines could not be crossed. "Dr. Chen," Morrison acknowledged her with obvious reluctance, "you and your associates need to clear this area immediately." "We're here as witnesses," James Clearwater said with quiet authority. "These horses are part of our cultural heritage, protected under the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. Any attempt to remove them without proper tribal consultation violates federal law." The standoff continued for nearly an hour, with neither side willing to back down. The horses remained calm behind Jeremiah, as if they understood that their fate was being decided by the courage of the humans who had chosen to stand with them. Finally, Marcus Whitmore's patience ran out. He climbed out of his SUV and approached Agent Morrison with the barely controlled anger of a man who was used to getting his way. "Morrison, I don't care what laws these people think they're citing. My company has invested too much money and political capital in this operation to be stopped by a handful of protesters. Give the order to proceed, or I'll find someone who will." The sound of helicopters approaching from the south changed everything in an instant. At first, Jeremiah thought Whitmore had called in additional federal support, but as the aircraft grew closer, it became clear that these were news helicopters carrying camera crews that would broadcast whatever happened next to the entire country. More importantly, The lead helicopter bore the markings of the governor's office, and when it landed in the meadow below the valley entrance, Governor Patricia Rawlings emerged with the purposeful stride of a politician who had decided that this situation required her personal attention. "Agent Morrison," the governor said without preamble, her voice carrying the authority of someone who outranked everyone present. "I'm ordering you to suspend this operation immediately pending a full review of the legal authorizations." Morrison looked confused and frustrated, clearly caught between conflicting orders from different levels of government. "Governor, I have federal directives, which I'm suspending under state emergency powers," Governor Rawlings interrupted. She turned to address the crowd of media representatives who were recording every word. "The state of Montana will not permit the destruction of our wildlife heritage based on questionable federal authorizations that bypass proper environmental and cultural protection procedures." Marcus Whitmore stepped forward, his face red with anger. "Governor, you're interfering with a legitimate federal operation authorized by congressional mandate. The mineral resources in this area are vital to national security interests." "Mr. Whitmore," the governor replied coolly, "I've spent the last 3 days reviewing the documentation surrounding your company's claims, and I've found significant irregularities in the permitting process. No congressional mandate has been issued, and the federal agencies involved appear to have exceeded their authority." She pulled out a folder of documents and handed copies to Agent Morrison and the assembled media. "These are injunctions issued by federal courts in 3 different jurisdictions, all ordering an immediate halt to any horse removal or mining preparation activities pending full legal review of the historical preservation claims." The effect was immediate and devastating for Pinnacle Development's position. The news crews that had been expecting to film a routine government operation suddenly found themselves documenting a major political confrontation that involved questions of federal overreach, environmental protection, and corporate manipulation of the legal system. David Chen made one last desperate attempt to salvage the situation. "Governor, these horses are just feral animals that have been breeding unchecked in a sensitive ecosystem. Their removal is necessary for proper land management." It was James Clearwater who answered him, his voice carrying the authority of someone speaking for thousands of years of cultural heritage. "These horses are descendants of animals that my people have honored for centuries. They are not feral. They are wild, as they were meant to be. And this valley is not just land to be managed. It is a sacred place that has been protected by alliance between my nation and the Tate family for over 130 years. Sarah stepped forward with documentation that she had been preparing for weeks. Genetic analysis of hair samples from the herd that proved their ancient bloodlines. Photographs showing behaviors that existed only in truly wild populations. And historical records that trace the horses' presence in the valley back to before the establishment of Montana Territory. These horses represent one of the most genetically pure wild herds remaining in North America," she announced to the assembled cameras. "Their conservation value is immeasurable, and their destruction would constitute an irreplaceable loss to the nation's biological heritage." As the legal and political tide turned decisively against them, Jeremiah watched Marcus Whitmore's composure finally crack completely. The man who had seemed so confident and powerful just hours before now looked like what he really was, a corporate executive who had overreached and been caught in actions that would not stand up to public scrutiny. "This isn't over," Whitmore said quietly to Jeremiah, as the federal agents began dismantling their equipment under the governor's direct orders. "My company has too much invested in this operation to walk away now. We'll find another approach." "Maybe." "You will," Jeremiah replied with a calmness that surprised even him. "But those horses aren't going anywhere, and neither am I. And now the whole world is watching." 6 months later, Jeremiah stood beside a new fence post at the entrance to what was now officially designated as the Tate Family Mustang Preserve. The post was made from local pine, weathered to blend with the landscape, but marked with a bronze plaque that told the story of Captain William Tate's original conservation mandate and the century-long effort to honor his vision. The horses had not only been saved, but had become the centerpiece of a new model for wildlife conservation that balanced protection with limited public access. Carefully managed tours brought visitors from around the world to see the herd that had captured international attention, generating revenue that supported both the horses' care and the economic development of Dry Ridge itself. Governor Rawlings had signed legislation creating a permanent state sanctuary around the valley, while federal authorities had quietly closed their investigation into Pinnacle Development's permitting irregularities. Marcus Whitmore's company had withdrawn from Montana entirely, their reputation damaged by the public exposure of their heavy-handed tactics. But for Jeremiah, the real victory was simpler and more personal. As he watched the lead mare graze peacefully, with her new foal, born free in the valley where her ancestors had lived for over a century, he knew that the trust between his family and the horses would continue for generations to come. The fence post marked more than just a boundary. It marked the fulfillment of a promise that had been waiting over 130 years to be kept. The bronze plaque gleamed in the late afternoon sun, its polished surface reflecting the words that had transformed Jeremiah from the town eccentric into something approaching a local legend. Tate Family Mustang Preserve, established 1888, Preserve 2024, home to the last free herd. 6 months had passed since the confrontation in the valley, and the changes had been more profound than anyone could have imagined. The dirt road that had once led only to Jeremiah's simple shack now carried a steady stream of visitors, researchers, photographers, families drawn by the story of the old cowboy who had stood against impossible odds to protect something precious. Dr. Sarah Chen had moved her veterinary practice to a new clinic built just outside the preserve boundaries, where she now served as the herd's primary caretaker and the scientific coordinator for the research projects that were documenting the horses' unique genetics and behaviors. The partnership between human science and animal wisdom that she had forged with Jeremiah had become a model for conservation efforts across the western states. But it was the changes in Jeremiah himself that might have been the most remarkable of all. The man who had once been dismissed as a harmless old fool now found himself consulted by government officials, interviewed by documentary filmmakers, and sought out by other landowners who were facing their own battles against development pressure. The shack itself had been carefully expanded and improved, its simple lines preserved, but its infrastructure modernized to accommodate Jeremiah's new role as guardian of the preserve. A small visitor center had been built nearby, staffed by volunteers from the community who had once laughed at his foolish land purchase. Eleanor Patterson had become the preserve's unofficial historian, leading tours that told the full story of Captain William Tate's original conservation vision and the century-long effort to honor his commitment. Her research had uncovered documents that were now housed in a climate-controlled archive, ensuring that future generations would understand the full scope of what had been preserved. Tom Murphy's saloon had been renamed the Wild Horse Tavern, its walls now decorated with photographs of the herd and artifacts from the preserve's history. The conversations around his bar had shifted from gentle mockery of Jeremiah's eccentricity to proud discussions of how their small community had stood up to powerful interests and won. James Clearwater had established a cultural education program that brought young people from the Blackfeet Nation to spend time with the horses, learning traditional skills and understanding their connection to the natural world. The alliance between the tribal nation and the Tate family had been formalized in ceremonies that honored both the horses and the human guardians who protected them. But perhaps the most significant change was in the horses themselves. While they remained genuinely wild, unbroken, and free to follow their ancient patterns, they had developed a unique relationship with their human protectors. The lead mare would often approach the fence line when Jeremiah was working nearby, as if checking on the guardian who had proven worthy of her trust. New foals were born each spring, their arrival celebrated by the growing community of people who understood that they were witnessing something extraordinary, the continuation of a bloodline that connected the present to a wilder, more authentic past. Each birth represented not just the survival of the herd, but the triumph of the idea that some things were worth protecting regardless of their commercial value. The preserve's success had attracted attention from conservation organizations around the world, and Jeremiah found himself traveling occasionally to share his story at conferences and symposiums. But he always returned quickly to the valley, understanding that his primary responsibility was to the horses who had made him the guardian of their sacred space. On quiet evenings, Jeremiah would ride Dusty to the highest point overlooking the valley, where he could see the entire herd spread out below him in the golden light of sunset. The sight never failed to fill him with wonder and gratitude, wonder at the beauty of these magnificent creatures, and gratitude that he had been chosen to play a role in their survival. The silver dollar that had purchased his 5 acres of worthless scrubland now sat in a place of honor on his mantelpiece, polished bright and mounted in a simple wooden frame. Visitors often asked about it, and Jeremiah would tell them the story of how little it sometimes takes to change everything. $1, one moment of courage, one decision to stand for something bigger than yourself. Martha's photograph sat beside the silver dollar, her gentle smile a reminder of the wisdom that had guided him to this place and this purpose. He spoke to her sometimes in the quiet hours before dawn, telling her about the horses and the community that had grown around their protection, confident that she would be proud of what they had accomplished together. The preserve had brought unexpected prosperity to Dry Ridge, but more importantly, it had brought purpose. The town that had once seemed to be slowly dying had found new life in its role as guardian of something genuinely precious. Young people who might have left for opportunities in larger cities now found meaningful work in conservation, education, and the growing ecotourism industry that surrounded the preserve. As winter approached and the horses grew their thick coats in preparation for the harsh months ahead, Jeremiah reflected on the journey that had brought him from lonely widower to respected guardian. The transformation had not been without cost. The stress of the legal battle had taken its toll on his health, and the responsibility of protecting the horses was sometimes overwhelming. But every morning when he stepped outside and heard the sounds of the herd moving through their ancient routines, he knew that every sacrifice had been worthwhile. He had become part of something larger than himself, connected to both the past and the future in ways that gave his life meaning beyond anything he had ever imagined possible. The bronze plaque would weather and age over the decades to come, but the commitment it represented would endure as long as there were people willing to understand that true wealth could not be measured in dollars, and that some trusts, once given, were meant to last forever. In the end, they had laughed at the old cowboy for buying a shack for $1, but they weren't laughing anymore.